Let's see. All right. Hello, everybody. It's good of you to join for this session called Mastering the Graph with Exchange PowerShell. I'm Tony Redmond. I'm probably a little bit known to some of you. I've been around for quite a long time in the exchange world. This is the 25th anniversary of the first MEC that I spoke at. I've been an Exchange MVP for a long time now, in an Office 365 Services MVP or something like that. I'm the lead author for the Office 365 IT Pros ebook. And there's Vasil Michif, who's our technical editor, is online as well. So he's the guy who's going to answer any really difficult questions about the graph. It's great to have him here. And I also look after Practical 365 as the editorial director there. So basically, I write a lot about this kind of stuff. Write about anything to do with Office 365, anything to do with Microsoft 365, because writing about something, if you don't actually go and investigate it, you're probably not going to come up with a very good article. So I spend a lot of time, as people like Vasil will tell you, just probing at things, trying to find out how it works. Now, I should make the point up front that I am not a professional programmer. The last professional programming work I did, I think, was with VAX 11 COBOL and VAX 11 BASIC. And that's a long time ago because we haven't had VAX systems in production for quite a while. I regard myself as a untalented hacker. So I will hack PowerShell out to make it work. It's never going to be an act of beauty. At least the code that I write is never going to be an act of beauty, but it serves to demonstrate a principle. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get across all the time. I figure that if I can show somebody how to do something, or learn how to do something myself, and then show other people how to do something, they can go ahead and figure out how to do all the professional programming stuff like build in really sophisticated error handling, logging routines that their company uses, integrate into their script repositories, and all that kind of stuff. I don't attempt to do that. All I'm attempt to do ever is to figure out how something works so I can explain to other people. And that's what the intention of this session here. So if you're a programmer and you expect to come here and get, all sorts of graph internals, you're not going to get that. But what you will hear is a lot of stuff about how I have approached the graph, coming from a position of being a hacker in Exchange PowerShell for a long time. And we'll see how that goes. So the kind of things I want to discuss, Exchange's relationship with PowerShell, the evolution to V2, some graph basics that you've got to understand before you plunge into the graph. I'll talk a little bit about the graph PowerShell SDK, which I think is a very interesting project. It's got its flaws like all projects, and talk a little about that. And we'll finish up talking a little bit about Azure automation, because sometimes you've got big scripts that are going to run for a long time, and it's good to have a place to have those scripts process, unless you like running them interactively yourself and looking at a screen for hours at a time, watching, mailbox process, etc., which isn't very interesting. So Exchange and PowerShell, right back. So when Jeffrey Snover wrote the Monad manifesto, it didn't really get a great reception within Microsoft. Nobody really saw the need for a scripting language that could do a job for servers. And the Exchange Server team was the first major Microsoft server product to take on and embrace PowerShell, as it was known in the past, Monad. So Exchange 2007, when it came out, it was a bit of a revolution because, all of a sudden we had the capability to do an awful lot of automation that had just not been possible before. Well, some of it had been possible before because there were things like WMI, which is another kind of script thing. I remember a book being written about that by a guy called Alain Lesoir, who did his level best to explain how to use WMI scripting to automate things, and it was always a pain. It also replaced and was really the first successful API that Exchange had ever delivered. Because you know what? In the past, there were tons of things like Exchange routing objects that go back, way back, and none of them had succeeded. So PowerShell was the first thing that came along in the Exchange world and really delivered something that allowed you to automate Exchange Server. And that was great. And it proved the basis of all of the Exchange administrative interfaces, including the Exchange Management Console and our Exchange Management Center and ECP. On one hand, you had the EMC, which was a desktop-based interface, and then ECP was a browser-based interface. And the interesting thing was that, and the great thing was that you could get and see the PowerShell code that these interfaces ran to do things like set up a new mailbox. That was a fantastic learning experience for people, to show them how they could take code, slap it together, and make things work. And it was one of the reasons why I think it was an act of absolute genius. It was one of the reasons why Exchange Server did so well with PowerShell. Then we move on a decade or more to 2019, where you've got the Exchange had gone from running PowerShell on a local server to running it with remote PowerShell, which allowed servers to be managed from any workstation. But then it hit this thing called the cloud. Now, in the early days, the cloud didn't matter so much, but as people ramped up and a huge amount of workload went into the cloud, all of a sudden people found that, well, oh, gee, this cloud stuff, remote PowerShell doesn't work so well. And I think Scott Schnall said yesterday there are 300,000 physical Exchange servers running across Office 365, running across Exchange Online. Well, roughly 10% of those servers are probably offline, being upgraded or whatnot on a day-to-day basis. So, there's a lot of flux in that in that platform. And if an Exchange server suddenly disappears in the middle of doing something, well, you end up with a PowerShell commandlet that can't complete. So the Exchange PowerShell v2 commandlets are built on REST-based APIs and are faster and are more resilient to problems. But at the end of the day, what we have is a set of fast REST-based commandlets and a whole pile of legacy stuff that has gradually been upgraded, but it still works pretty well the same way. And the thing about Exchange PowerShell is that it's still fantastic. You can still get a great deal of work done with Exchange PowerShell. You can get a fantastic amount of work done by Exchange PowerShell. And those of us that have been playing around with it for years and years and years remember the first scripts we wrote, and we still probably remember the last scripts we wrote. But at the end of the day, really, Exchange PowerShell only goes so far. And part of the reason is that, well, Exchange has got a lot of things to do as part of Microsoft 365. It's not just its own ecosystem. It has to operate in this grand space that's Microsoft 365. And especially it's got to do a lot of interaction with Azure AD. So it's not just Exchange baby anymore. There's a lot more to do. And then Exchange has got to deal with this thing that the graph APIs is the lingua franca. It's the common language for Microsoft 365 programming and automation. It's not PowerShell anymore so much. I mean, there are PowerShell modules out there for a lot of Microsoft 365, but there in some cases there are no PowerShell modules available for bits of Microsoft 365. So what do you do then? Well, the answer is you've got to revert back to the graph. An Outlook Graph API is available, but honestly, Exchange lags here. It lags because in terms of being able to provide Graph API calls to deal with mailbox and server management in the same type of way that you do something like get mailbox or get mailbox folder statistics or something like that. That's a weak area. On the other side, you've got EWS, Exchange Web Services. Microsoft would like people, their customers and ISVs, the guys that build all the add-on products for Exchange, they'd like them to move from EWS. But in some cases, there's this inability to move because there aren't the graph APIs. And then we've got the deprecation of some popular modules. Two particular ones I'm going to draw your attention to, the Azure AD and MSOL. The MSOL is the old time Microsoft Services, Online Services module. Azure AD, more modern, but both of these are being deprecated. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of scripts out there that are going to need revisiting. And I guess any opportunity to rewrite code, it's an opportunity to think about how you're going to rewrite code. In terms of Azure AD and Microsoft MSOL, the license management commandlets are on their last legs. And in fact, in some tenants, you can't run these commandlets anymore to do license management. By March 2023, those commandlets, those modules go away, and you will have had to upgrade any scripts that use these modules. So there's a couple of challenges around. In terms of PowerShell across Microsoft 365, it's not just Exchange that has some difficulties. For me, if I'm going to do something to automate a process, I would probably start off with PowerShell. That's because it's ingrained in me after so many years. Yep, PowerShell is what I do. It's terrifically important. But the problems that you've got to face when you're looking at using PowerShell on an ongoing basis is that you've got multiple modules out there. Okay, and in some cases, the modules are layered right on top of the graph. For example, Teams, all the Teams modules, the modern Teams commandlets are built on top of the graph, and then they have a whole bunch of other modules, commandlets that were inherited from Skype from Business Online. A lot of the old policy management commandlets, they use a slightly different format. So, there's an inconsistency there. There's a thing, speed is a problem for when you're dealing with large numbers of objects. And indeed, with some of the complex objects. Microsoft 365 groups is a very good example. The get unified group commandlet will fetch you all the Microsoft 365 groups in your tenant, but it will take time. Why does it take time? Well, because it's figuring out all of the links with SharePoint and how many group members there are and how many guest members are in the group. All of this kind of stuff has got to be brought together by the commandlet. Sometimes you don't need that kind of stuff, and sometimes it's better to just go and get the group object itself and then figure out how to process it later on. Then there's the lack of support for some Microsoft 365 workloads. Planner is a very good example of that. And finally, there's the access to a lot of the tenant and management data is just not available using PowerShell. For example, the graph, the Microsoft 365 usage reports that you get in the admin center, they allow you to obscure data that can be used to identify people, like their display names or group names or site names. There's a setting to control that. You may want to create reports using this data using PowerShell, and that's just fine. But you may not want to have these obscured, these concealed display names. You can't go and switch that control off with PowerShell. You have to do it with the graph. And this happens time after time after time after Microsoft introduces new settings inside Microsoft 365. So the point here is PowerShell is still incredibly important. I don't want anybody going away from this session saying, hey, Tony Redmond said that PowerShell is dead for Microsoft 365. PowerShell is not dead. PowerShell will continue to be a hugely important management automation technology for Microsoft 365 for the immediate future. But what I'm saying to you is that there are some flaws. And what I'm saying to you is that some of those flaws can be covered over with by a little bit of an application of some graph APIs, some graph queries here, there, and everywhere. And that's what you get for happiness. So what I am suggesting is that you think about combining the graph and PowerShell, because those graph API queries, they enable access to all manner of data. They're the fastest way to access data. Just measure, for example, do let's see, get Azure AD user to get all the Azure AD users. Now do it with the Graph API call, and you'll see the difference. Okay. And the thing about it is, these queries can all be executed directly from PowerShell. You know, so there's no barrier in place there's nothing there to stop you executing Graph API queries direct from PowerShell. So in fact, you can do a little bit of surgery on scripts, as we'll talk about in a little while, to selectively upgrade the scripts to replace, let's say, your most processing intensive parts of the script with some Graph API calls, and all of a sudden you've got a script which believes it's a 21-year-old and can drink forever. It's great. I will say that the Graph SDK is a great thing because it makes many of the Graph API queries available as standard PowerShell commandlets. However, there's a downside to this. How does Microsoft generate 4,000 odd commandlets in the PowerShell SDK? Well, they don't do it with people. They do it with technology. It's a technology called autorest. And like all technologies, it has its ups and downs. On the upside, you get the commandlets. On the downside, the documentation that is generated alongside by the same process is kind of weird at times, doesn't have great examples, and is just weird. I've said weird twice. Take it from me, it's just weird. The documentation is just weird, right? And the other thing I say is that sometimes the commandlets can be a bit weird as well in terms of their input and output, in terms of the parameters they take and the data they return. However, in general, the PowerShell SDK is maturing very nicely and is getting better all the time and is very valuable. So it's a thing to actually remember to use. Okay, some graph basics. If you're going to interact with the graph, you're going to have to interact through an app of some form. An app is just a convenient way of registering an interest in Azure AD to say, hey, you know what? At the end of the day, I want to authenticate using OAuth. I want to gain authorization to access some data on this tenant. And I want to do it through this app. And this app is going to give me the identity that's required to prove that I have access to the data that I'm going to request. Now, there's a good, I've no real problem with the approach that Microsoft has taken here, apart from the fact that over time you can end up with a heck of a lot of app registrations in Azure AD. And unless some control is placed over those app registrations, you're probably going to forget at times what app does what for what script. So some level of control is probably needed, and I'll leave that to yourselves to figure out how you're going to control all the apps that are configured to use with PowerShell, with Azure automation, with managed identities, etc., etc. But anyway, starting point, you're going to need an app registration to get into PowerShell, to get PowerShell working with Graph. Okay, second thing, when you authenticate, you're going to look for an access token. And an access token contains the permissions for an app to access data. Now, there are tons of permissions in the graph, and there are other permissions as well. Like there's a permission to run Exchange in the same way as a management application runs. There are also things called difference between delegated and application permissions. A delegated permission basically means that you're executing with the user there. So if you got a delegate permission to access somebody's mailbox, you're going to access that mailbox for that user when they're signed in. On the other hand, an application permission is a lot more powerful because an application permission allows you to get to data across the tenant. So same thing, if I've got an application permission like mail read, all, then I can read the contents of everybody's mailbox in the tenant. Now, there are some limitations. For example, you could be reading a mailbox, and if there's some encrypted mail in there, mail that's got a sensitivity label that stops you reading it, you won't be able to see it. But generally, once I've got an application permission to get at some sort of container, I'll be able to read everything in that container. That's good. Then apps have service principals. And a graph designer once told me that a service principal is no more than a convenient container to hold permissions. And that's a good way of thinking about it, because a service principal come along, it's holding this list of permissions, and that's what the graph is going to use to check to say, oh, have you got that permission to get to that data? Oh, you have. Okay, go on. Next thing is that graph queries restrict the amount of data that's returned. And this is an important differentiation for a PowerShell person. And we see it at times in PowerShell, but maybe you haven't met it. For example, if you do a get mailbox and you say result size 5,000, Exchange will give you 5,000 mailboxes right back if there are 5,000 mailboxes to be fetched. But with the graph, you're more likely to get 100 items or 200 items, because the graph sets these limits, and the limits vary from different across different endpoints and different APIs. They limit the amount of data that is given back to you to avoid the situation where resources are consumed by apps when they don't need to be. So if you want to get all the users, for example, in a tenant, and there are several thousand of them, you're going to paginate, you're going to get back pages of data to fetch everything until you have it all, and then you can process it. So that's another graph basics. And we talked a little bit about permissions, but from an Exchange perspective or Exchange PowerShell perspective, when you think about it, once you started off Exchange and you're signed into a management account, you're all powerful. You can run any commandlet in the module, and you can affect any mailbox or whatever, or group or whatever. However, in the graph, we operate in the spaces called least permissions. So you don't get everything. You only get permissions if you ask for permissions and you are consented to allow you to use those permissions. So that's a kind of a different model to get your head around. Then you get this thing like every graph API has its own permissions, like user.readAll, which is the permission to read all the user information in the tenant. Apps need permissions to run graph queries. If you try and run a graph query without having the right permission, boom, you're not going to have it. Nope, it's just going to fail. And the registered app that you use, its service principal holds those permissions. Now, you could get to a situation, and some very clever people have said this is a good thing to do, but I don't think it is, where you have a single registered app that's used for all PowerShell scripts which interact with the graph. You say, well, that sounds like a good idea, because I'll end up then only having to maintain one registered app. Everybody can use that registered app, and they'll all be able to use graph API calls with our queries with PowerShell. Sounds wonderful. The problem with this is that that app will end up as holding a whole pile of permissions that are not needed for some scripts. And in fact, if you run the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK interactively, you can get into exactly this permission, because the SDK has a service principal. It's got an app, so it's got a service principal. And that service principal holds all of the permissions that people have used when they have connected with that app to interact with the graph. So if you look at, if I was to go on to a tenant and that uses the Graph SDK, and one that uses it interactively rather than running jobs in the batch, I bet you that service principal has a ton of permissions. So the important thing here is that when you move over to the graph, you start thinking about, well, what permissions do I really need? And you try and limit the permissions at all times. Okay, you're very careful not to over permission apps. And one of the reasons why you do that is that attackers could try and use a thing called illicit consent grant to take over apps, or to plant malware apps in your tenant. And those malware apps would have things called high priority permissions. Those are permissions that will allow them to do a lot of things like read all the data in the tenant and take data out of the tenant or make changes to data in the tenant. So it's really important that people keep an eye on permissions. And it's really important that you keep an eye on apps that are defined within a tenant to make sure that the apps have the right permission level for the job they're designed to do. Okay, and I think we talked about that there. It's better to have a set of registered apps configured with just enough permissions. Okay, so much for all of the basic stuff. Let's get on to developing some PowerShell scripts now. I'm not brave enough, as Michelle was in a session earlier today, to do stuff interactively. So I've just got slides, which means everything works. It's great. Okay, the general approach I take. You have to understand the context. What's your source data, your expected output, what apps are available, what APIs are available. Then you code in PowerShell first. Get everything working. It may be slow, but it'll work. Now, sometimes PowerShell won't work, in which case you'll be forced to use the graph straight away. But generally speaking, you can write the code first in PowerShell. Then go and selectively upgrade code segments. Find the bits where you can really improve performance. For example, the get team commandlet is quite slow. Microsoft have improved its performance over time, but get team is quite slow. I would prefer to use a graph query to get teams by running it against the groups API and filtering what comes back. It's much better. Okay, so once you've adjusted and you have selectively upgraded your code segment, you can make all the changes you need for production. You know, how the code will run, authenticate, for example. You might use app secrets in testing. You're not going to use them in production. You're probably going to use certificate-based authentication, or you might push some data into Azure Key Vault and read from that or whatever. Okay. And the bullet at the bottom is very important. The production level of the graph is v1.0, and it's been v1.0 for years and years and years and years and years. When Microsoft introduces a new API, they put it in the beta endpoint. So you go and you get it there. And eventually they say, yeah, that's all works. There's no bugs in it. It's brilliant. And they move it back into v1.0. At that time, things may break, scripts may break because some of the syntax may change. So keep an eye on what versions of the graph you're using, and keep an eye on when things change, when the APIs change. Lots of things to keep an eye on. The tool set that's available. Firstly, most important one is the Microsoft Graph Explorer. This is fantastic. We'll talk about that in a little moment. Second thing, there are 2 PowerShell commandlets available to run graph queries. I prefer invoke REST method because it's the one that's designed to run REST-based APIs, which is what graph APIs are. So use that. Then there's the graph SDK, and you can use that to replace graph queries if you like, if you want to use what, in quote marks, pure PowerShell commandlets. And then there's this thing. This goes back a long, long way. When you care to steal from the very best, this means don't be proud. There is a lot of PowerShell code written out there. It's available in places like GitHub, blog posts and whatever. Please don't recreate the wheel. Go and find some code that works and build off that. That's the right way to do it. That's the PowerShell way. It's always been the way since people start writing the first PowerShell scripts to get a list of mailboxes. That's what we've all done. There's no reason to stop doing that now. Okay, the Graph Explorer. This is a great tool. It was a utility created by Microsoft to allow developers to see the effects of graph queries. Now you can see the effect by running it against a dummy set of data, which is what happens when you don't sign into the Graph Explorer. On the other hand, if you sign into the Graph Explorer, you can run queries against live data that you have access to in your tenant. So this is pretty cool. As you can see in the screenshot, I was able to run one of the demo queries that are available in the Explorer to find my photo. Or I find myself in flying form at some conference somewhere. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, the best thing about the Graph Explorer is that it helps you to debug graph queries. Graph queries can be a little bit convoluted. You know, it's a language all of their own. And like any language, it takes you time to understand the syntax. It takes you time to understand some of the kinks in the language. And it takes you time to figure out maybe even some of the how would I say it, the oddities, the idiosyncrasies of a language. So before you plug anything into a script, you can plug it into the Graph Explorer and see, does your code work? If it does, great, then you know you've got a great query that you can lift from the Graph Explorer and put into your script, and you have a pretty good chance that it's going to work, which is a great thing in my mind. Okay, let's have a look at a little bit of code. This is code to get an access token. And you know, we're not going to spend too much time in it, but you can see basically that you've got an app ID. That identifies the app in Azure AD. You've got a tenant ID. That's your tenant. That's what we're going to run with. Then you've got an app secret. And as I said earlier, you can use an app secret for testing, but you're probably going to do certificate-based authentication or use something like a managed identity in production. That's fine. Then we define a URI. And the URI points to the OAuth 2 token issuing endpoint. We create a body, which is a little hash table with all of these parameters. We run a request, which is in this case using invoke web request. We post to the URI that we just set up, and we say, hey, we'd like to get something back. We get it back, and we convert it from the JSON format that it comes back, and we got it. There you go. You got a token. You're ready. Now that token contains all of the permissions that the app is allowed to use. Not your account, the app. If the app doesn't have permission to do something, you're out of luck. You could have the best account in the world. You could be the global administrator of all global administrators, but unless that app has the permission, the access token won't have the permission, and you're out of luck. So this is the what's essentially happened. We've identified those. We've defined those identifiers for the registered app, the tenant, the app secret. Define the URI, define the parameters, run a web request, unpack, come back, which is grand. Note that access token lasts 59 minutes. So if you've got a script that runs for a very long time, you know, you're fetching a lot of data and you're doing a lot of manipulations. Maybe you've got 10,000 mailboxes to clean up. I don't know what you're going to do. But let's say that you've got your script lasts for more than 59 minutes. At that point, you're going to have to refresh the access token. You're basically going to have to say to Azure AD, still working, can I have another access token? And Azure AD will say, sure, and give you one, and you can continue working. So bear that in mind for long running scripts. Okay. And there, as I say, there are many examples of how to gain an access token available on the internet. So just go and find one that works for you. And when you find one that works for you and you're happy with it, use the same code time and time again. This is a great opportunity to master that unique and beautiful technique called cut and paste. Don't recreate any wheels. So tips, let's see. Tips, yeah, we already talked about using Graph Explorer. I said that invoke REST method is the preferred commandlet to run graph queries. Now, I used invoke web request to get a token. That's okay. I wasn't talking to a Graph API, but you'll see later that we were going to use invoke REST method elsewhere. And then there's all these things I can do. I can get data, post data, patch data, delete data. So these are all HTTPS requests, which are grand. Okay. A point though that you are going to have to figure out and get to use, get accustomed to. In Exchange PowerShell, when you start passing identities, you're probably used to passing things like a display name, a mailbox alias, or something like that. The graph loves GUIDs. GUIDs are unique, and that's why the graph uses them. So be ready
Ah
to
bah,
use GUIDs everywhere,
c'est pour ça
right?
que elle était oui.
Sometimes you can use user principal names, but mostly you're going to be using GUIDs. And when you think about it, Exchange makes this really easy for you because if you look at mail-enabled objects, they'll have a property called external directory object ID. That points to the object identifier, the GUID, in Azure AD. So that's a good way. For example, if you have a mailbox, you have the external directory object ID, it points to the Azure AD account that owns the mailbox. So it makes it all easy. But it's a thing that to think about. You are going to have to get used to GUIDs. And that took me a little while to get used to. Okay, here's a couple of other graph queries. First one, get the SharePoint Online usage data for the last 180 days. So there's a graph, usage reports API. It's the API that's used for any of the usage reports that you see in Microsoft 365. So it's the usage reports in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It's the usage reports in the Teams Admin Center. It's the usage reports that are pumped out to Power BI. All come from the same source, right? So you can go back to that source and you can say, give me data. And in this case, I'm saying I'm creating a URI pointing to the get SharePoint site usage detail node. I'm going to say for the period is 180 days. So give me that. And it just basically goes and I've invoked REST method to that URI with the headers that I defined previously. It's the method is get, so I'm getting data. I'm saying that the content type is going to be application JSON. And then I have a little thing afterwards, little PowerShell thing afterwards. It's just replace the data that comes back. There's a couple of spaces in there. And so I'm just getting rid of that. And then I'm going to convert whatever is handed back from the graph, convert it from the CSV format that the graph uses. In this case, the graph uses CSV format in this case, but it doesn't always use CSV when it puts back. In this case, because it's a report, CSV is a good format, but in most cases, you're going to get back something like a JSON. The next one is just let's get a list of Microsoft 365 groups. Okay, and this is where I'm going to the groups API and I'm applying a filter. Now, you notice that there's that tick there before $filter because of course in PowerShell, if you got a $sign, you've got to escape it. If you don't do that, then when you feed this in from PowerShell to the graph, that dollar won't be there and the command won't work. Okay. That filter type is a thing called the Lambda qualifier, and it's basically saying go and check the group's type property of a group and find any of them that match unified in that property. And basically then I say groups get graph data. So what's that? Well, in fact, that's a function to handle pagination because if I don't, if I just say get these groups, I'll only get back the first 100 groups. So I want to get all groups. And so I have a function then that's written to handle pagination. And there are tons of these type of functions out there on the internet. So that's another thing to go and get, make sure you have and use it. Use it all the time. Use it everywhere you go and it'll make things a lot easier for you. And then the last one there is another example of just, I just want to count. I just want a count of the guest members in a group. That's how we do it. This time I'm passing a group identifier in $group.id. So that is the external directory object ID of the group that I have in Exchange. I just pass that and I get the stuff out. So that all looks really horrible, but here's one that Basile will be very used to because we talked about it a day or so ago when I was preparing this presentation. I was trying to get this to work and he helped me get it work. This is one which is kind of complex because it starts off with users where I've got a user account, which is identified by the first GUID there. Then I say go down to the mail folders that belong to that user account, and I give it this horrible identifier, which identifies a mail folder. Then I say go to the messages part, the messages within that folder. And then when I found the messages, select from those messages just these properties. I then want to filter the set of messages that are handed back from the graph to say that I want to only get messages that have got a receive date roughly a year ago. And you notice the Z at the end of the date times that I'm using there. That's important. If you don't leave that Z there, it won't work. And the final thing was, well, if I'm getting messages, I'd like to know how big the messages are. And as it turns out, to get that kind of information, you have to go through this hoop of getting a single value extended property and passing it a MAPI tag. Gosh, there's exchange history coming back to bite you. Now, this is a very complex query. You won't see this very often. And when you do see it, you will have reached the stage of nirvana and be in graph happiness. So that's all goodness. So as we said, you have to pay attention to pagination. This is to reduce the strain on the service. So what actually happens when pagination occurs is that the graph gives you back the first page of data. Let's say it's 10 items or 50 items or 100 items. There is actually a top parameter that you can pass to control how many items you want to receive in a page, but that's going to top out maybe at 999. Okay, and when this happens and the graph knows that more data is there to be retrieved, it will send back an OData next link, a URI, a special form of a URI in the data it returns. And that URI points to the next page of data. So essentially what happens is you get your 100 groups or your 100 mailboxes or your 100 user accounts or whatever, and it comes back and the graph has posted this special URI, this next link URI in the data it's returned. Your code has got to be watching for that and says, okay, there's a next link here. And because there's a next link here, I've got to use that to get to the next page of data and continue doing that until no more next links are returned. That's basically how you deal with pagination. Again, that's a good reason for going out to the web and finding a function that handles all this and using it. Filters. Filters are important because it's a bit like the debate in PowerShell between server-side filters and client-side filters. And as you know, in PowerShell, you always want to use server-side filters to make sure that you reduce the amount of data that's returned to you. Same idea, except that you're going to pass it in a slightly different way. So in this case, the URI that I'm passing is for the service announcement API, and it's saying, okay, give me all the service announcements that have occurred in a particular date range that are not yet resolved, and that the status is service degradation. Service announcements are things like exchanges offline. We don't know what's happening, but we'll get back to you when we're ready. So it's a good idea to be able to get that kind of thing. So you're going to say, this is all too much. My brain is now hurting. Can I have some examples? And here are some examples. And of course, you're saying, I don't have this presentation. Where am I going to get all these these links that are pointed to here? And the answer is I'm going to post them in the chat in just a few minutes. So a couple of graph examples I'm going to talk about: reporting the activity of groups and teams, reporting user activities. That's kind of interesting because you go to the usage reports API and you get all the various bits of data, like what mail activity user has, what Teams activity, what OneDrive, what Yammer activity, what SharePoint activity. You combine it all together and you provide a composite to show what how active a user is. That's kind of a good example of the graph at its best, I think. There's another one there, decrypting SharePoint online documents that are protected with sensitivity labels. You may have to do that if somebody leaves the company and they've left a whole pile of documents that are protected with SharePoint with sensitivity labels and nobody can read them. You may have to do that. Calculate counts of distribution list members, sending email with the graph. That's definitely a thing that you're going to have to get used to, because while Exchange is deprecating, it's removing 7 email connection protocols quite soon, you know, at the end of the year, if you don't ask for an opt-out. And March 2023, if you do. Eventually, although Microsoft is not deprecating the SMTP auth protocol yet, eventually that's going to go. And when that happens, all those send mail message commandlets that you're using in scripts, they're not going to work anymore. So you're going to have to change all of those to send mail with the graph. It's just the way it is. So there's a thing for you. And the final one, creating organizational contacts in user mailbox. This is an idea where, you know, a new user joins the organization, they don't know anybody, so it's a nice idea to pop some organizational contacts into their mailbox. So they start off with, you know, contacts for HR, contacts for, I don't know, sports clubs or whatever that they might want to use straight away. Now, very quickly, let's talk about the SDK. The SDK, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK, is a wrapper around graph queries to make them easier to use in PowerShell scripts. Yes, they are much easier to use in PowerShell scripts than writing all of that code that you saw just a few minutes ago. There are 31 separate modules. There are over 4,000 commandlets, and they're generated automatically for every month. Okay, the current version is actually ticked up one. It's now 1.11.1. So you can go and get that. Most of the documentation, as I said earlier, is weird because it's generated automatically. So I don't think computers speak English. Definitely, they don't generate English. And the SDK documentation is eloquent evidence of this fact. The SDK uses graph permissions, which are assigned to service principals, either the service principal that you use for interactive use, which we discussed previously, or for an app that you create to use the graph SDK commandlet in production. It supports interactive sessions, it supports certificate-based authentication, and supports managed identities. Okay, so that's all good. Some examples. Get MG user, get a user, get an Azure AD user. It's the equivalent of get Azure AD user. Get MG group, get MG device, get one of the registered devices on your in your environment. Get MG user license detail. Give me back all of the licenses that an Azure AD user account has. And then, apart from gets, you have updates, which are things like update MG user, update MG group. Notice it's not set. Mostly it's update, but there are, as the screen shows, there are exceptions, like set MG user license, which is there to update the set of licenses that a user account has. And then there's this very, very useful commandlet called invoke MG graph request, which allows you to send any graph request for execution without having to write, without having to have or set up a new app to do it. You just do it right there in your script. So we talked a little bit about this, but I want everybody to be really, really, really sure about it. Azure AD account licensing is changing. It's changing because Microsoft is moving to a new license management platform. The license management platform that existed for years and years and years is going. Microsoft has pushed the dates out for this retirement a couple of times. They're now holding firm to a point that the new license management platform will be used everywhere as of March, the end of March 2023. So any script that uses the old MSOL or the Azure AD license management commandlets will cease working soon. And there are lots of these scripts out there. There are lots of automated new user creation scripts that will create a new Azure AD account, set up a mailbox, and I'll assign all the licenses that you want people to have. They all need updating. It is really, really, really important to go and update these scripts very soon. So please think about doing that. And you will upgrade those scripts by replacing the commandlets, the MSOL and Azure AD license management commandlets with Microsoft Graph, PowerShell SDK commandlets or graph queries. Okay, so some thoughts about the SDK versus graph queries. Clearly, the SDK commandlets are easier to use because if you come from PowerShell, you'll find that they work the same kind of way. You don't have to get your head around the raw graph queries. Some commandlets take care of pagination, which is great. For example, if you use the all parameter with get mg user, it gets all the users. Fantastic. But that is not the same everywhere. My general advice is to go and use the SDK first, and then if you have to use a raw graph query later when the SDK doesn't work for you or there isn't a suitable commandlet. So final point, Azure automation. Azure automation is a way of scheduling stuff, and the right thing to schedule are resource intensive scripts using Azure. So basically it spins up a VM, it runs PowerShell on the VM and hands you back the results. But this requires paid Azure subscription. Now, the paid Azure subscription covers the compute costs and covers some storage costs. Generally, I find I only spend a couple of dollars a month on this, so it's not going to be a big thing. It uses automation accounts, so you have these run as accounts or you have managed identities. I prefer managed identities because it's a very secure way of running scripts. You don't have to do anything to manage the identities. Microsoft will do it all for you. It schedules scripts and things called runbooks. You can run periodically, once a week, once a blue moon, whatever, it'll do it. It supports most of the Microsoft 365 PowerShell modules. It also supports graph queries, so you can mix and match in the same runbook and all will be well. If you have scripts that deal with a lot of resources, they take a long time, you want to move them across to Azure automation, that's totally possible. I will say it will take you a little bit of changes. Basically you're in a headless space, so anything that you try and output or any questions you ask, that's not going to work. You're talking into a vacuum, so some of that will have to be done. Okay, so basically, conclusion after all of that, I'm sorry I went through it really fast. My conclusion, keep on using PowerShell. Keep on using PowerShell and use the V2 module. Don't use anything else for ad hoc processing of Exchange Online and use the other PowerShell modules to access other Microsoft 365 data when modules are available. So keep on using PowerShell. No reason to stop using PowerShell. But then if you want to turbocharge things, use the graph APIs. That will absolutely give your scripts a new lift and allow you to get the scripts running much faster and possibly even more securely if you do them over on Azure automation. Whew, that's it. So now let me get I had a list of resources prepared. So I'm going to get them and post them into the sure. I'm going to post them into the chat. Chat amongst yourselves there while I do this, but I'm going to post them into the chat and let you see them. You'll be able to quickly cut and paste them and keep them to one side. Go on, there you go. There you go. There's lots of things for you to look at. Okay. Any questions? Gosh, you're all very quiet. Have I baffled you?
All in chat.
I tell you, you could spend hours doing this kind of thing.
I do notice the graph commands that are replacing the MSOL commands are missing some features, like yes. We sync from AD to the cloud, and the MSOL commands, for instance, a room list, we have to delete, for some reason, the sync is broke between them and it got unhinged. And with the MSOL commands, I could force remove that cloud object. Yep. I can't seem to find a graph command version that lets me do that.
Yeah, I think so Microsoft has what they call a commandlet map. Go search for commandlet map on the internet.
And I did that.
Yeah. So yeah, well, okay. Well, I'm telling it so everybody else knows about it.
Okay.
I'm not just talking to you. Anyway, by the way, have I told you I'm a grumpy old man? I am a grumpy old man. Anyway, so the commandlet map will tell you the current state of affairs in terms of transition from the old commandlets to the new commandlets. And it is a work that is continuing as new versions of the SDK roll out. So do keep an eye on that. And it's known that there are some deficiencies. Shall I put it like that? It's a very delicate way of saying it, but there are known deficiencies that have to be fixed. That's one of the reasons why Microsoft pushed the date for retirement out. I mean, they originally wanted to get rid of this on, was it August the 26th? I mean, we should already be a month past the deprecation of all these commandlets, but it hasn't happened. And the reason is, they weren't ready, customers weren't ready, so it was a good idea to pause. So I'm hoping that things will get better over the next couple of months. I live in a state of perpetual hope, though. And I don't always get my way.
But Tony, yeah, we have a really, really large environment, millions of objects and hundreds of thousands of stuff. Yeah, one thing that I've seen with graphs, while it's very, very fast, is the filtering just seems a little convoluted, and it's difficult to get back the type of filtering you were able to do with Exchange Online. Recipient types, for example, if you want to just look at all shared mailboxes and stuff like that, hopefully they will improve upon that. Or if anybody has any tips or tricks for getting some of those filters nailed down from an Exchange Online perspective, that would be helpful.
Yeah, you're probably going to have to. I mean, some of the pro developers will probably help you on this. I, not being a pro developer, neatly get out of it, but I think there's been some work done, I think, and documented out there on the interweb of people dealing with very, very large amounts of objects. Without sight the tenant, without sight of what you're doing, it's impossible to say anything else, really.
Yeah. Catch-22.
Read Vasil's blog. He does good, and Glenn Scales does an extremely good blog.
Yeah,
about dealing with that.
Stuff. Yeah, thanks.
This might be a silly question, but Azure Automation, is that just kind of scoped for Office 365 and Azure AD, or could you possibly use that for on-prem AD as well?
It's basically any Azure resource. So I'm not sure that it's going to do much for your on-prem thing. It's a cloud thing.
You can set up hybrid worker groups, and then you can also use it to do anything in Azure AD or Exchange on-prem.
Yeah, there you go. There's a pro developer right there.
Which brings up a question I had.
Not a pro developer.
Well, you know more about this than anybody else on this session, so
because
you're more intelligent than 150 other people.
Yeah, we use it in our tenant.
If I have a really long-running script running in a hybrid worker from Azure Automation PowerShell runbook, does it count against the first 500 minutes free and then start accruing cost in Azure Automation account, or does it not count against that? Because we have like 6 or 7 scripts that run 24/7.
Wow. You know what? I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
I have not found that anywhere on the internet.
Well, could you not just ask Microsoft?
Can you repeat the question, maybe?
If I've got a script that's running like 24/7, but it's in Azure Automation runbook, but it's running on a hybrid worker, so an on-prem VM, but from Azure Automation, Does it count against my Azure Automation runtime minutes?
Yeah, as long as the script is running, it's runtime execution, so it counts against your minutes. Yes,
Okay.
At least in my opinion. So I don't know. So the script runs for 24 hours. So
24/7. It runs nonstop.
Okay.
So and so that's why we'd run it on a hybrid worker, because I think there's a 3-hour limit if you're running it in Azure Automation natively.
Okay.
And we have 7 of those scripts.
You see, the thing is that if we had an in kind of person event, we'd be able to go to the bar and discuss this kind of thing in depth. And now, you know, because we're all in the cloud, we're just going to get terminated in a moment. I mean, it's sad.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, I just had to say that. Oh gosh, next year. I believe MEC is going to be in person next year. That's just a rumor. I haven't been told this in person. It's just a rumor, but I'm spreading it now.